Ladies and gentlemen, something about April feels wrong before it even arrives. Not dramatic at first, not cinematic, just wrong in the way adults recognize before they can explain it. Prices stay high, markets look nervous. The news cycle feels swollen with unfinished conflict. People are still going to work, still driving carpool routes, still buying coffee, still paying mortgages. But the rhythm underneath everyday life feels strained, as if the country is holding its breath and trying not to admit it. That is where this story begins. Not with a comet, not with a miracle, not with a headline everyone can point to. It begins with a warning from a well-known American Vedic astrologer named Evelyn Hart, a woman in her 60s who built a quiet reputation through long interviews, private consulting, and years of uncanny timing. She is not presented here as an authority on truth, only as the keeper of a pattern. And according to her reading, April is not another month. It is a hinge. She says the first hinge arrives around April 13th. In her view, that date marks the start of a pressure cycle, when hidden instability begins surfacing through the most practical parts of life. Fuel, shipping, movement, supply, and public nerves. She does not speak in the language of fantasy. She speaks in the language of systems, ports, tankers, sea lanes, energy contracts, inflation, fragile confidence, the kind of things most people ignore until they reach the gas pump or the grocery aisle. Skeptics hear that and roll their eyes. Fair enough. Astrology is not policy. It is not evidence in a courtroom. But Hart's deeper point is harder to dismiss. Whether the stars cause anything or simply mirror it, the weak points in modern life are real. The system is fast, global, efficient, and brittle. That makes April dangerous, even before anyone uses the word destiny. And if April 13th is only the opening strain, then the real shock is still waiting behind it. Hart's first warning centers on a symbolic clash. In her reading, Mars represents heat, force, aggression, and ignition. Not just war in the military sense, but any energy that pushes too hard, too fast, with too little restraint. Neptune, by contrast, rules the sea, the hidden, the difficult to measure, and in modern terms, the entire deep-water world of oil, gas, shipping, and offshore vulnerability. When those two forces move into tension, Hart says the most exposed points are not abstract. They are maritime choke points, war fuel routes, and the global arteries that keep ordinary life functioning. That sounds remote until it reaches Houston, or Newark, or Long Beach, or the Gulf, or the price board at a truck stop outside Tulsa. America does not experience oil shocks as philosophy. It experiences them as freight costs, airline surcharges, fertilizer prices, school district budgets, and families standing in supermarket aisles doing mental math they never used to do. A shipping delay overseas can turn into expensive produce in Ohio. A fuel squeeze can reshape daily life in Phoenix, Des Moines, and Jacksonville within days. Hart's argument is that mid-April amplifies exactly that kind of chain reaction. In her framework, the cause is symbolic. In practical life, the effect is brutally real. Sea routes get tense, insurance premiums jump. Tankers wait longer. Storm conditions complicate schedules. Traders panic early. Politicians speak too confidently. The first people to pay are never the ones on television. They are retirees on fixed income, single parents, delivery drivers, small contractors, couples already living between paycheck and credit card. There is, of course, a rational objection. The world has weathered energy shocks before. Systems adjust, markets settle, governments intervene. That is true. But Hart's counterpoint is that this is not a normal season of strain. It is a season when pressure arrives on top of pressure. The shipping issue is not the event. It is the trigger that tells you how tired everything else already is. And by the time Americans feel it at the family table, the larger machinery may already be slipping. Adults over 30 know the difference between fear and inconvenience. Inconvenience is a bad commute. Fear is watching the cost of ordinary life rise while every institution insists things are manageable. That is the emotional territory Hart places America in as April deepens. Not collapse, not yet, but a narrowing. The sense that more and more people are living inside smaller margins while leaders speak in larger abstractions. That is why her warning resonates. Because it does not begin with missiles or mass panic. It begins with groceries, diesel, heating bills, pharmacy receipts, school lunch costs. A gallon of gas does not look like a geopolitical instrument until it steals breathing room from an entire household budget. Hart believes mid-April may expose how close to the edge millions of people already are. The real crisis, and then, is not only economic, it is psychological. When people feel cornered, attention changes. They stop listening for nuance. They listen for relief. That is when false certainty becomes powerful. Loud voices feel safer than honest ones. Simplistic explanations beat complicated truths. The public conversation hardens. One side blames elites, another blames foreigners, another blames technology, another blames greed. Most people, meanwhile, just want rent to stay paid and the car to keep running. This is where Hart becomes more interesting than sensational. She does not say disaster arrives from nowhere. She says a pressure point reveals what was already unresolved. The April Fuel story, in her telling, is really a story about dependence. About how much of modern calm depends on invisible coordination across oceans, terminals, on satellites, contracts, weather windows, and political restraint. Once that calm is interrupted, people discover how much of their normal life rested on systems they never had to think about. And still, even that is not the center of her forecast. In Hart's reading, April 13th is not the main event. It is the rumble beneath the floorboards. The larger disturbance gathers closer to April 19th and 20th, when a different kind of pressure takes hold. One that affects transport, communication, leadership, and collective judgment all at once. If April 13th is about friction, April 19th and 20th are about compression. That is how Hart describes them. In her astrological model, the energy of action becomes boxed in by heavier, colder, less forgiving forces. The result is not forward motion, it is congestion. Systems that normally absorb strain begin to jam. Travel gets messy. Communication gets distorted. Decisions arrive late or poorly. The problem is not speed. It is trapped momentum. A machine still spinning, but no longer moving cleanly. Translated into American life, that means the most ordinary networks start feeling unstable. Flights stack up, freight timing slips, data errors multiply, stories break, then change, then break again in a different form. Supply managers lose confidence. Markets overreact. Political staffs stop trusting the first report they receive. Ordinary people sense the tension without having the language for it. They feel it in exhausted customer service lines, glitching updates, delayed shipments, anxious text threads, and the low-grade irritation that spreads through a nation before anything obvious is admitted. Hart's most useful insight here is not mystical. It is structural. When transportation and communication are both under strain, nothing stays isolated. A delayed cargo movement becomes a late warehouse handoff. A late handoff becomes a missing shelf product. A confusing statement becomes a rumor. A rumor becomes a run on a thing that was never scarce until people treated it like it was. Americans know this pattern now. It is no longer theoretical, and once again, skeptics can object. Every month has delays. Every year has overreaction. Why make these dates special? Hart's answer is that some windows intensify what is already primed. Not every spark causes a fire. But in dry conditions, one spark matters more. Her claim is that April's second half is dry in exactly that way, logistically, psychologically, and politically, which leads to the darker part of her forecast. Because in her language, compression never lasts forever. Eventually it breaks. And when it breaks under the wrong kind of pressure, it does not release gently. It releases through a human event powerful enough to redraw the mood of the world overnight. Before Hart gets to the political shock, she stops at something many viewers will understand instinctively. She says there are times when a whole culture feels tired at once. Not sleepy, not lazy, tired in the soul. She describes late April as one of those periods, a stretch when people feel heavy without knowing why, when patience shortens, sleep gets thinner, tempers spark faster, news feels louder, private worries feel closer. Even people who avoid astrology entirely will recognize the experience. There are weeks when the world seems to lean on everyone at once. Hart believes those weeks matter because public events do not unfold in a vacuum. They land inside human nervous systems that are already overloaded. That is why her reading of April is not just economic or geopolitical, it is emotional. In her telling, the pressure of these days forces both nations and individuals to face unfinished business, old grudges, hidden debts, strategic lies, personal delusions, institutional rot. Hart argues that a jammed season exposes what a smooth season can hide. The slower the machine becomes, the more visible its flaws. A person rushing through life can avoid reflection. A society under pressure cannot avoid it for long. There is even a moral argument buried inside her forecast. She says the blockage itself may be corrective, not pleasant, not fair in any sentimental sense, but corrective, a forced pause, a harsh demand that leaders answer for what they postponed and households face what they denied. This is where the story becomes deeper than doom. Hart is not only saying, something bad may happen. She is saying, what happens may expose what was already broken. That is a painful idea. It is also a mature one, because adults know crises rarely create character. They reveal it. And if April is, in Hart's imagination, a season of revelation through pressure, then the sharpest revelation is still ahead. According to her most controversial claim, the dates around April 19th and 20th may not only disrupt systems. They may coincide with the sudden fall of someone the modern world assumed could not fall. This is the point in Hart's forecast where even sympathetic listeners grow cautious. They should, because this is where speculation becomes most dramatic. Hart says the symbolic pattern around April 19th to 20th points toward a deathbed alignment, a phrase she uses to describe a configuration associated not with ordinary disruption, but with finality. In her interpretation, that finality does not concern a random person. It concerns someone near the peak of global influence, a leader whose decisions affect markets, alliances, intelligence structures, and military balance far beyond his own country. Notice the framing, not certainty, possibility, not a named person, a role. That distinction matters. Still, even the possibility is enough to chill the imagination. Because one does not need to believe in astrology to understand the consequences of a powerful leader suddenly dying, collapsing, resigning under medical crisis, or becoming incapacitated during a season of global instability. In Washington, in Brussels, in Moscow, in Beijing, in every market that trades on continuity, such an event would be treated not as personal tragedy alone, but as strategic shock. Hart's point is not that death itself changes everything. It is that timing does. A major leadership loss during a fragile window amplifies uncertainty everywhere else. Rivals test boundaries, allies recalculate, investors flee predictability. Succession battles harden, conspiracy spreads faster than verified information. And because modern politics is theatrical even in its darkest moments, the world stops to watch while the machinery behind the curtains begins fighting over what comes next. The reasonable counterargument is obvious. States survive leaders all the time. Institutions are designed for continuity. Again, true. But continuity works best in stable periods. During unstable periods, one absence can act like a pulled thread. Hart's warning is not that one death ends the world. It is that one abrupt removal, at the wrong moment, can expose how much of the existing order depended on a person, a myth, a perception of control, or a balance nobody realized was already fragile. That is why, in her telling, the real danger is not only the loss, it is the vacuum that follows. A vacuum in politics never stays empty. That is one of Hart's most grounded observations. When a major figure disappears from the board, while people rush toward the open space, some do it out of duty, some out of fear, some out of naked appetite. That is why Hart believes the days after a leadership shock could feel more dangerous than the event itself. Markets can process death. Nations struggle more with ambition released at the wrong time. In her scenario, alliances begin wobbling first, not necessarily collapsing, but showing stress fractures. Old agreements suddenly look negotiable. Quiet enemies become bold. Proxy actors test boundaries. Commentators use the language of stability, while power brokers behave as if the map is being redrawn underneath them. In democratic countries, this looks like emergency messaging, internal party war, legal jockeying, and media frenzy. In less transparent states, it looks like silence followed by movement. What matters, Hart says, is not the theater. It is the opening. Whenever an order looks weak, opportunists emerge. Not always with tanks, sometimes with contracts, leaks, cyber pressure, energy leverage, or carefully timed unrest. The result is the same. The public experiences it as confusion. The elite experience it as scramble. And those two experiences feed each other until rumor feels almost as powerful as law. For ordinary Americans, the consequence is indirect but real. Volatility gets personal. Retirement accounts swing. Interest rates twitch. Energy fears deepen. Media saturation worsens anxiety. Families at dinner tables talk less about ideology and more about whether the world has become harder to read. That is the true human cost of elite instability. It moves downstream, then enters kitchens as mood, caution, and financial pressure. Hart does not present this as the end of civilization. She presents it as a rupture, a forced transition, ugly, destabilizing, and potentially necessary. In her view, the world order entering April is already overstretched and dishonest. The shock does not create the dishonesty. It removes the mask from it. Once that happens, the next phase begins. Not immediate peace, but exposure. And this is where Hart's forecast turns in a direction many viewers will find even more unsettling than political death. Because she believes the months after April are not only about damage, they are about disclosure. If April is the storm, Hart says May, June, and July are the opening. That does not mean life becomes instantly easy. It means concealment becomes harder. In her language, the same forces that squeeze systems in April begin stripping cover from old secrets in early summer. Not magical secrets in the fairy tale sense. Institutional secrets, buried files, hidden research, classified programs, stories that were dismissed for decades, not because they were impossible, but because they were inconvenient. Hart believes the months after the rupture may produce a wave of disclosure unlike anything modern adults have lived through. She points to 3 domains: the ocean, space, artificial intelligence. Again, this is speculative material, and it should stay framed that way. But the script of her argument is compelling. She says the modern world knows far less about the deep ocean than it likes to admit, despite all our satellites and submersibles. She believes that as governments lose control of the old narrative, they may be forced to acknowledge data, footage, or infrastructure linked to deep water anomalies that were kept compartmentalized for years. In plain language, what lies beneath the sea may not be as simple as textbooks suggested. Her second claim is broader. She argues the public story about humanity's isolation in the universe may not survive the next disclosure cycle. Not because Hollywood dreams become fact overnight, but because enough fragments, military observations, aerospace black budgets, sensor records, recovered materials, unexplained patterns, may accumulate until denial becomes less credible than admission. Then comes AI. Hart's interpretation is not that artificial intelligence is evil, quite the opposite. She says the real shock may be learning how quickly its breakthroughs accelerated, and how incomplete the public story about that acceleration has been. Her hope, in fact, is that AI becomes part of healing rather than domination. Medical modeling, environmental restoration, pattern recognition, translation, and breakthroughs that feel less like invention from scratch and more like access to something long hidden. Whether you believe any of that literally is not the point. The point is what disclosure does to a civilization. It breaks old certainty. And once certainty breaks, people either become more manipulative or more awake. Hart does not romanticize awakening. She says awakening is usually ugly first. People like the idea of truth until truth arrives carrying loss. If even part of the old framework collapses, about government transparency, about technology, about what has been hidden in oceanic or aerospace archives, then the first response will not be universal peace. It will be disorientation, anger, embarrassment, grief, a generational sense of having been managed, not informed. Adults in their 40s, 50s, and 60s may feel it especially hard because they built lives on certain assumptions about institutions, expertise, and official reality. That is why Hart sees the summer not only as revelation, but as sorting. Some people will cling harder to old narratives, even when those narratives are plainly cracking. Others will swing too far in the opposite direction and believe everything reckless. Between those extremes lies the harder path, absorbing change without losing judgment. That, in her view, is the real spiritual task of the post-April world. And yet she remains strangely hopeful. She believes truth, even disruptive truth, can lower the temperature over time. Once enough lies lose their force, people stop wasting energy defending them. Old rivalries begin to look childish. Dogma softens. Public life becomes less about maintaining fiction and more about adapting to reality. In that sense, disclosure does not save humanity by magic. It saves it by exhausting the old manipulations. The American version of this would be messy and familiar. Congressional hearings, cable news hysteria, podcasts claiming victory, church groups debating theology, retired pilots suddenly treated as serious witnesses, teachers rewriting lesson plans, teenagers adjusting faster than their parents, neighbors in cul-de-sacs discussing the future beside pickup trucks and patio grills, as if the universe had shown up in suburban life uninvited. Hart says all of that belongs to the process. Shock first, meaning later. And if society can endure the first without breaking into permanent cynicism, then something unexpected may emerge in late summer. Not utopia, but clarity. A quieter, harder, more adult form of hope. By the end of Hart's forecast, the stars almost stop mattering. That may sound strange, but it is true. Because the longer you sit with her story, the clearer the real question becomes. Not whether every prediction lands exactly. Not whether every symbol corresponds to an event on schedule. The deeper question is simpler and more uncomfortable. What happens to a civilization when pressure strips away its distractions? That is what this script has really been about. April, in Hart's telling, is the month when systems reveal their fragility. Energy routes, public confidence, leadership stability, information flow. Then the summer becomes the season when old walls crack and buried truths begin reaching daylight. You do not have to take the astrological frame literally to understand the emotional logic. Pressure first, exposure second, reorientation third, cause, then consequence, then reckoning. If there is wisdom in that structure, it is not because destiny is fixed. It is because human beings often wait too long to face what they already sense. Hart herself leaves room for that. She does not present fate as a locked iron gate. She presents it as a tightening corridor. The narrower it gets, the harder denial becomes. But choice still matters. So does character. So does how people treat one another while the world feels unstable. That is why this should be heard as a reflective, speculative story, not a command to panic. If April passes quietly, the lesson still stands. If April turns hard, the lesson matters even more. Stay steady. Avoid hysteria. Watch systems, not slogans. Watch character, not spectacle. And remember that every era of exposure feels unbearable to the people living inside it, right up until it becomes the history that changed them. That is where I will leave this story. If it stayed with you, subscribe to the channel, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this video with someone who values calm thinking in chaotic times.